Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas not a fortnight ago that, while attending a dinner party at Lord Grenville's residence, I chanced to enter into conversation with a certain Robert Owen, a young gentleman affiliated with the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society. Owen is a manager at a textile factory, and known among the industry for his efficient yet humane treatment of workers. As we conversed, he outlined an idea he had about forming a community, either here or in America. He thought to call it New Harmony. I asked in what way it would differ from any regular village or town, and he said, children older than 3 would be raised communally, apart from their families. People would not have to work to get food or housing, and property was to be, to a degree, held in common. My response to these 3 suggestions was, I didn't know a single mother who would agree to part for very many hours with her young children. Without the prospect of hunger or individual material gain, people would not work. And C, property held in common as women seemed a dreadful idea. Owen, however, though not having any reply to my rejoinders, nonetheless remained stubbornly attached to his vision. Now, if we turn to the ideas of egalitarian and communitarian societies, whether voluntary or state, in your 21st century, we find a recent book written in 2022 by prominent public intellectual James Lindsay, allegedly discussing just this topic. Here Lindsay expands on his previous treatment of modern ideologies in Cynical Theories, written with Helen Pluckrose, to argue now that the ideology of critical race theory, or CRT, is actually a distinct species of Marxism, namely Race Marxism. James breaks his book down into 6 chapters. The first defines CRT theorists. The second tells us what they believe. The third and fourth outline the proximate and deep ideological origins of their theories. The fifth focuses on their praxis, and the sixth on possible societal solutions towards combating this ideology. Let's see what he says in each chapter and then evaluate the totality. Chapter 1, defining critical race theory. A first definition, what he calls a simple way of characterizing critical race theory, is the following. An activist movement based upon a motivated study of what it calls systemic racism and how that phenomenon defines power and creates oppression in society. Note that here he is calling the theory a movement, not a theory. He also believes that getting political power is their fundamental goal. As for seizing power, this is easily the central but hidden interest of critical race theorists, to transform the relationship among race, racism, and power. One of the reasons that he believes it's Marxist is because CRT theorists have called themselves a bunch of Marxists in a founding conference of theirs that met in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989. Lindsay adds that critical race theorists tend to refer to economic or classical Marxism as vulgar Marxism, which would imply that their own theory is both Marxian and somehow more sophisticated than the original. A second definition he gives is the belief that racism that benefits white people, white supremacy, is the fundamental organizing principle of society. Critical race theory scapegoats whiteness for the problems of society. Moreover, it does so in almost perfect parallel to the ways Marxists have scapegoated capitalists and nationalist socialists scapegoated Jews. I would note, however, that scapegoats are common to many ideologies. A corollary of James's understanding is related to the notion of private property. He says, critical race theory frames whiteness as a type of property that is meant to be abolished in precisely the same way as Marx meant when he said that the meaning of communism is abolition of private property. A second corollary is that in CRT, systemic racism is upheld by people who do not realize they're upholding it. So their alleged racism is unconscious. A third corollary is that critical race theory is a totalizing belief system because it sees everything in society in this way. A fourth corollary is that he regards CRT as a religion. He says, critical race theory holds this tortured, totalizing view as a basic presupposition, something it believes before the evidence is brought to bear. This qualifies critical race theory as a fundamentalist faith. I don't mean to say that critical race theory is like a religion, I mean that it is one. Having finished examining his definitions, let's head to Chapter 2, entitled What Critical Race Theory Believes. He here listing 12 points which are held to be its core beliefs. Some of these 12 have already been mentioned or implied, and we'll get to others later, but let's cover 4 fairly unique ones now. A, the interest convergence theory of Derek Bell. As he says, it's a theory originated by lawyers and Professor Derek Bell that essentially asserts that whites will do everything in their own interests with no desire to help blacks or people of other races. In other words, you can only understand white actions if you realize that they, whether male or female, are irredeemably self-serving, racist bastards. An alleged example given by Bell of whites always thinking only of themselves was the Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated public schools in the South. Instead of seeing this as racial progress leading to a more equitable racial society, Bell posits that white America did it merely to look good against the constant communist claim, made often in the 1950s, that America discriminated against blacks even in its school systems. So Bell says that it was just a ploy in the fight against communism. Another example claimed by CRT theorists was the Reagan administration's giving reparations to Japanese Americans for their internment during World War II, which was given around the time that the administration wanted to get a good trade deal with Japan in the 1980s. So more self-serving white people. B, the belief in material determinism by racial category. In this aspect of CRT, according to James, previous bad or negative treatment of blacks like redlining, white flight, Jim Crow, segregation, and even slavery were material conditions that Marxists so often stress, which continue to affect blacks detrimentally to this day, allegedly. C, social construction and imposition of race. Here James explains that CRT theorists generally regard the concept of race as a fiction, with no relevant racial distinctions existing among men, according to them, and between people of different skin color. In other words, they reject the notion of race. On the other hand, they regard white Americans as believing that skin color determines many characteristics of blacks, implying that whites believe essentially that blacks are dumber, cruder, more lustful, less controlled, and more lazy because they're black. D, belief in structural determinism by racial category. This is the most difficult and least obvious concept. What does it mean? Apparently, in strict Marxism, it means that a given technological base of a society will result deterministically in a superstructure of society where people taken statistically as a group will have predetermined values and attitudes. James believes that CRT theorists use this concept with regard to race, not economics, as classical Marxists do. He says, because of its belief in structural determinism, critical race theory is committed to the idea of analysis at the group level and thus identity politics. I would disagree, saying that they're committed to identity politics simply because they're racists, all of whom necessarily are collectivists by definition. In other words, the starting point for their identity politics is their racism, not their Marxism, as James thinks. Now on to chapters 3 and 4, where he gives us what he believes to be the proximate and deep ideological origins of CRT. Chapter 3, the proximate ideological origins. In this chapter, James is looking at fairly recent thinkers within the last century that he believes influenced the intellectual development of CRT. As he says, it's a bit like peeling an onion, so we need to work our way backwards through time. So what type of recent thinkers is he going to focus on? What are called neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist, and postmodernist. What is neo-Marxism basically? According to James, a Marxian admission that advanced capitalism works, combined with the belief that this is a serious problem in need of a radical solution so that communism can still be achieved. And what is the associated idea of false consciousness? James says, the profoundly conspiratorial and presumptuous belief that subjugated people tend not to be aware of this fact and to believe themselves to be freer and happier than they are. A key Marxist thinker was Antonio Gramsci, who recognized that culture is produced, upheld, and transmitted in key cultural institutions, and changing a culture to make way for Marxism is to be accomplished by infiltrating and changing those key institutions from within. This way of thinking came to be known in the 1960s as the Long March through the institutions. James would point to the schools as an example of this. James regards this belief of neo-Marxists as key to understanding the rise of their ideology. As he says, critical race theory fits right into this cultural Marxist and neo-Marxist mold. It focuses relentlessly on cultural institutions. It began in law and rapidly spread to education and then the media. In this connection, James highlights the Brazilian Marxist educator Paulo Freire, through which Gramscian thought is effectively dominant in North American schools today. James mentions the role in critical theory of Hungarian literary critic and Marxist intellectual György Lukács. James saying of Lukács that he became the theoretician for the Hungarian version of the Bolshevik Red Terror and undermined traditional morality in Hungary by teaching debauched sexuality to school children. We have a similar Lukácsian problem in our schools now, don't we? Finally, he discusses Herbert Marcuse, who attempted to mobilize various radical minority communities in the 1960s for a new proletariat that might carry out his revolutionary ambitions. James believes that Marcuse lays the groundwork that has become the identity Marxism of today by looking for a new proletariat who can rise up with the necessary consciousness and in sufficient numbers by blending these groups together in solidarity, which is now the glue of intersectionality. He adds, the goal of neo-Marxism is cultural revolution, a destabilizing period in which the existing society is undermined and demoralized of its ability to resist a mostly bureaucratic takeover of its institutions by neo-Marxists. In this intention to overthrow present-day America, he attributes to CRT theorists generally. James concludes the section overall by discussing postmodernism and the rise of intersectionality, which he believes dangerous as a unifying force, combining neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism, and postmodernism. He says, darkly, referencing Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, that intersectionality is equivalent to the forging of the One Ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. Let's now turn to chapter 4, where James discusses thinkers even further back in time, Marx, Hegel, and Rousseau. To start, James believes that a dialectical thought must be comprehended to comprehend critical race theory. And in order to understand that, we need to understand Karl Marx. Here James says an astonishing thing. Marxism is a profoundly misunderstood ideology. The prevailing view is that Marx offered an economic theory. This is not true in the slightest. Marx co-opted ideas from a set of economic theories broadly known as socialism for the purpose of moving along as revolutionary theory. More accurately, Marxism is a theory of social conflict along lines of class stratification with the intention to create a total social revolution. James briefly mentions Marx's surplus theory of value. He says, labor is considered holy in the Marxian religion. In fact, the entire problem with the bourgeoisie for Marx is that it shouldn't exist because it only exists by positioning itself to manage, exploit, and rob the worker of the surplus value created by his labor. Work, then, is sacred in Marxism, and thus the hammer and sickle can be understood as a religious icon in a very real sense. Turning to Hegel, James says, by way of introducing Hegel's use of dialectic, the key innovation Hegel brought to this process is negative thinking. Whatever is must be confronted with its negative, ostensibly in pursuit of something more. We must understand that Hegel's dialectical thought is also revolutionary, quite literally. Hegel believes that there are contradictions in nature, but these can become elevated, or in German, aufgehoben, and resolve themselves in a resolution or synthesis. Hegel loved the state. James describes this by saying that Hegel insisted the state is the divine idea as it exists on earth, meaning that the way that thinking humans gain mastery over nature by organizing into a state is how the divine will actualize in the mundane, a contradiction, and then become a synthesis. He believes that this idea drove many of the totalitarian disasters of the 20th century. Regarding Hegel's dialectic working itself out in history, the old Hegelians didn't just believe the dialectic could end, they believed that it more or less had, and that the Prussian state of the 1830s and 40s represented what it looked like. For Hegel and his system, the dialectic isn't even a means of analysis. It is an act of something that does one thing and one thing only. It progresses. Finally, briefly, James turns to Rousseau, saying, I only want to say a little about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Comparatively, Rousseau was surprisingly down on reason and rationality. Since Rousseau emphasized sincerity, James believes there is a parallel with CRT, saying, the idea that one's lived experience of the lived realities of systemic racism are deemed more sincere and better than true is central to critical race theory. I see zero reason to imagine any connection in this respect between Rousseau and CRT theory. Having dealt with James's treatment of these three thinkers, let's finally check out his fifth chapter. Here outlining his views on critical race praxis. In other words, all the practical things that CRT people do or try to do to change society. Critical race praxis. And what do CRT people do exactly? He says one thing and only this one thing, to raise a racial critical consciousness, which is to say, makes more critical race theorists. And how do they do this? By seizing the means of cultural production and repurposing them to evangelize critical race theory. Schools, colleges, and universities become critical race theory programming centers. Corporations become critical race theory programming centers through human resource departments. Legal outfits, government agencies, and courts become means by which critical race theory gets further codified into law. And how do they convert people to their ideology? In his view, societally and institutionally, by creating racial conflict. In critical race praxis, a relentless smear campaign, and sometimes worse, may be applied to anyone who does not move in the desired direction after a precipitating event. Those who take the side of the activists increase their commitment in the ensuing identity class conflict, and those who don't are ostracized and effectively discredited. In other words, they gain some sympathetic support and then renormalize the institution by raising a huge stink around some event. Finally, James describes various rhetorical tactics or logical fallacies that they use and ways that they manipulate language by equivocating between various terms, B, by using normal terms like diversity, democracy, or inclusion in a different specialized sense, or C, by the ability to take any given response and define it as racist. As James concludes, these abusive manipulations are par for the course throughout communist history. So that concludes our somewhat lengthy survey of the nuts and bolts of James's approach. So what do I say to all this? I say that while James has presented his ideas, as usual, in a remarkably clear manner, the opposite of the postmodernists he so ably criticizes, and while he helps us throughout the book understand the meaning of the terms that CRT theorists use, overall this book makes numerous mistakes and thus can only garner a C+. Let's go through these one by one. Mistake number 1. The first issue is the ever-present fallacy found among so many anti-woke theorists in calling this secular ideology a religion. As we've seen, James does this too. But what makes an ideology, which is a self-deceptive belief system, religious or secular? Secular ideologies like fascism, communism, and extreme environmentalism use secular methods of self-deception, while the religious imagine the supernatural occurring. That's the difference. Let me give examples. Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, and many other CRT theorists argue that systemic racism is what drives American society. But racism, as we know, can exist and still exists in individual cases today. So the self-deception of Kendi and company exists not in positing something that's impossible, but in imagining that it exists to a much greater degree than it actually does in society. So I would estimate that while white-on-black racism explains less than 1% of black underperformance in America today, Kendi and company would have us believe that it explains 90 to 100. Their self-deception lies in the amount. A second example is illustrated with Marxist theory. The fundamental self-deception of Marx was to imagine that the labor theory of value is true, and also that capitalists exploit workers by stealing surplus value from the products they make and not giving them fair wages in return. All of Marxism flows from these two economic fallacies. But sometimes it's true that the more a craftsman works, the more value a product he's making will have. But it's not necessarily true. He could turn out garbage. Similarly, sometimes an individual apprentice who, let's imagine, is shy and unassuming, may allow himself to be exploited by a master craftsman who appropriates the surplus value of his labor. So it can happen. But overall, in the economy, workers are fairly compensated for their wages because these psychological factors even out statistically over millions of cases. The preceding is not the case with religions. Religions imagine the supernatural, the impossible. They imagine the Holy Spirit impregnating Mary, Jesus rising on the third day, the Lord speaking to Abraham, Jesus driving devils into swine, souls being reincarnated and having knowledge of past lives, and most improbable of all, L. Ron Hubbard as a god. These things are impossible and thus use a different kind of self-deception than occurs with those I just described. All clear? Incidentally, at one point, James defines a religion as a comprehensive belief system that addresses the fundamental questions of human existence, such as the meaning of life and death, man's role in the universe, and the nature of good and evil, and it gives rise to duties of conscience. This definition completely fails because this is exactly what philosophies are, and philosophies couldn't be more distinct intellectually from religions. Mistake number 2. In order to understand whether James's fundamental thesis that CRT is most accurately described as race Marxism is not just true but important to worry about or relevant, we need to describe the most important areas to focus on when evaluating the intrinsic ideological strength of any given historical ideology. There are 3 main areas. Let's use the example of historical Christianity to illustrate. First, imagine if someone interpreted the course and historical development of Christian theology over 2 millennia purely sequentially by the influence of one religious person or theologian on another. So from Jesus to his disciples, to the early church fathers, to Thomas Aquinas, to Luther and Calvin, and on to the more modern skeptical theologians. Would that give us an accurate historical understanding of all the forces and influences at work on the course of Christian theology? No, it would be horribly inaccurate because it would leave out the varying use of state force in favor of Catholicism for over a millennium. Early Christianity had dozens of different sects, most of which lost their power when the doctrines associated with the Bishop of Rome became predominant, he using state force on his behalf. When, in addition, Catholicism became a state religion in 380 AD, using violence to stamp out these and other sects and pagan temples and beliefs. When the popes during the Middle Ages established the Spanish, French, Roman, and other inquisitions to torture and kill heretics. When huge amounts of tax monies were used by the church to propagandize its theology everywhere and spread it by indoctrination in schools, churches, and monasteries. And when, finally, the Reformation was able to protect heretics like Luther so that Christianity could become reformed and less violent and fundamentalist. So Protestant theology emerged because state power was now used to protect, not to destroy, the Catholic Church's intellectual competitors. And this is a mistake that James makes in imagining that no state force, violence, tax monies, or laws have been used to privilege the rise of CRT over other, better belief systems. For him, it's the equivalent of an Oxford Union debate, one set of ideas over others over the course of 3 centuries. And James makes this mistake because he doesn't know anything about economics and political science. And why doesn't he know anything about these subjects? Because, as was discussed in a recent book that I reviewed, Range by David Epstein, James can be regarded intellectually as an I person, not a T person. I people get huge amounts of knowledge about one area. They drill down, 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 like James in the History of Ideas, but neglect getting knowledge about other broader areas, more superficially, so have less range as a thinker, at least here with regard to economics and politics. And this describes James to a T, or more accurately, an I. Physicist and mathematician Freeman Dyson termed it the turtles versus the birds. So regarding the spread of CRT, all James does, knowing no economics, is to see the result, their increasing power, and assume it must be due to the slickness of the ideas and the aggressiveness of their praxis. So he naturally focuses on the doctrines of D'Angelo, Kendi, Bell, Crenshaw, Marx, Hegel, and Rousseau, and imagine these all working their effects in history. But the actual causes which gave rise to CRT are A, the huge increase in the amounts of coercive tax monies taken from the American people and given to American higher education since World War II, which directly subsidized the growth of these ideologies, just like with Catholicism. B, the many tax breaks for private colleges on capital gains and property tax, just like the tax breaks given to the French Church before the Revolution. And C, the accreditation agencies in Titles 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Acts, which have backstopped and enforced these harmful ideologies in schools and many other institutions through governmental bureaucracies like the Office of Civil Rights and the EEOC. I explain this all in my review, James's Cynical Theories, starting at the 1350 timestamp. Or alternately, in my longer 4-part series, The Actual Cause of Political Correctness, parts 1 through 4. This was, in fact, the very reason I've come back from the 18th century. So to return and summarize thus far, the first area to focus on in examining the rise of any ideology is the degree to which it started voluntarily, like Christianity in the very beginning, or with force and the use of state violence, like Christianity later. James, being an I, not a T person, is completely and utterly oblivious to the role of violence in ideology formation over time. B. The second main area to focus on in analyzing any given historical ideology is whether the main ideas of an ideology are true or false and why. Very simple in theory. So take the top 10 or 20 core beliefs of any ideology and examine them for truth or falsehood and why? This James only rarely does. And why is examining truth or falsehood important? We can illustrate again by referring to our historical example of Christianity, contrasting the Christian understanding of the origin of species, God's imagination and will creating them, with the actual cause of the origin of species, natural selection and genetic mutation. Once you actually understand evolution biologically, once Charles Darwin and his successors came along, humanity could see how false Christian ideas of it are. There's no substitute for the truth, for understanding. So let's now do the same and examine the truth of specific fallacies of CRT, which James doesn't do to illustrate this process. Note incidentally that I've dedicated a whole video towards showing the falsehoods of CRT in my video D'Angelo's Dogmas, and a second video describing Kennedy's falsehoods in Ibram's ideology. First example, Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility constantly charges whites with believing in white supremacy. And by this, of course, she means a racial supremacy, that whites believe they're racially superior. But everyone in America today can see that the black community is underperforming compared to many other ethnic communities. Why is this? As I and others such as Walter Williams, Thomas Sowell, and Jason Riley have argued, it's largely because of the enormous and disproportionate role of government in affecting the black community in policies ranging from the welfare state to the drug war, public education, affirmative action, minimum wage laws, Social Security, and others. All these policies affect the black community more than the white, and so the black community not only underperforms more, but subsequently develops a culture of underperformance. If only 25% of Americans understood the truth of what I just said, Robin DiAngelo would never have the slightest chance in giving Americans a guilt trip. Excuse me. As she often does in her anti-racist seminars by accusing them of being racist. Instead, it would be understood to be the fault of liberals like her and all those who have supported and voted for these governmental policies for over a half century. So the best vaccine against the intellectual virus of CRT is the truth. But James mainly is just interested in telling us about Marx, Hegel, and Rousseau. Number 2. Another second illustration is the almost universal ignorance by everyone that capitalism, not anti-discrimination laws, as James seems to think, having been a liberal for much of his life, is the best cure for racism. The racism that Kennedy claims is produced by capitalism. Richard Epstein, for example, in his book Forbidden Grounds, which I reviewed here, discusses in detail how, in the postbellum South, capitalism in the form of trolley car companies led to a gradual reduction in the racist treatment of blacks because for the owners of trolley car lines and for fellow riders, racism entailed running 2 segregated trolley cars instead of 1 and double the fare for riders. And so over time in the mainly capitalistic South, most people initially were choosing to act in these public forums in a less racist way because capitalism reduces racism. That is, it was reducing racism until various state laws were passed and the Supreme Court supported those racist laws in the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, which allowed states to mandate segregated cars, thus preventing capitalism from working its anti-racist magic. This truth, like the previous, will be a great vaccine against the virus of CRT if it were only better known. C. Let's finally now return to the third and finally area of focus when evaluating any given historical ideology, an examination of the terms used like systemic racism, unconscious bias, and white supremacy and what they have meant historically. And this is what James does well in this book, telling us in great detail, given that as an I person, he studied this for many years, how these terms have been used historically and what they've meant for all the different types of thinkers involved. So now we're finally ready to answer the fundamental question this book raises. Is CRT race Marxism? And the answer is that whether it is or not is not important. not relevant, not something to worry about. Because the first two issues that I just mentioned, whether state violence was used to privilege and fund the rise of an ideology, and whether its core components are true or false, are of far greater importance in understanding it and its power and fighting it. What James does in this book is only number 3, telling us what the terms mean and how CRT theorists use them. But nonetheless, is CRT race Marxism? Is James right? No, he's not. Let me explain why. A. As I outlined previously, the core deception of Marx was to use the faulty labor theory of value with its associated faulty notion of surplus value to argue that capitalism was inherently unjust and immoral. These two fallacies were crucial because without them, there is no false consciousness of the proletariat. There is no class warfare, there is no need for revolution and dictatorship, and no need for any dialectic to work its way through the alleged stages of history. Because capitalism would then be the optimal way of organizing societies, economically and morally. Anything further would be a regress. In other words, Marxism really is primarily the vulgar Marxism that both CRT theorists and James Lindsay reject. In addition, B, another reason the CRT isn't race Marxism is that Marx never talked about race theoretically, ever. So to make CRT, which is all about the central self-deception that whites are racist, into a Marxist theory whose prime deceptions come from economics and which never talked about race, makes no sense logically or psychologically. Neither does James's belief, quoted previously, that the idea that Marx offered an economic theory is not true in the slightest. Thomas Sowell in his book Marxism and Ludwig von Mises in his Marxism Unmasked were right and James Lindsay wrong. Marxism is primarily economic. C. Incidentally, one technique that James uses constantly, whether unintentionally or intentionally, to try to prove that CRT is race Marxism is to point out aspects of CRT that are common to all ideologies as ideologies, and then claim CRT is Marxist because of these. This makes the theory look much more Marxist than it ever could be. Here are 10 examples. Number 1, he says, as for seizing power, this is easily the central but hidden interest of critical race theorists. If this were true, it would only make it similar to many different ideologies that have wanted dominant political power, as James himself admits, calling it totalitarian. Catholicism, Islam, nationalism, and fascism have all wanted and achieved political power at times, but this didn't make them Marxian, just a typical dangerous ideology. Example number 2. He says that, unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. And he argues that because of this, it is Marxian, which is also activist. The fallacy here is that most ideologies have an activist component. Many Christian denominations, for example, believe in actively converting others or bearing witness, whether in their native land or by going to other countries. Muslims definitely believe in being activists in many different ways, from observing Ramadan to regular praying to blowing up skyscrapers. Green activists who love to splash glue on paintings in the Louvre or line the roadway are being activists. And many forms of political totalitarianism were obviously very active during the 20th century. That doesn't make them Marxist. Number 3. He notes that neo-Marxist Herbert Marcuse, who was an originator of identity politics, and then argues that this is a core component of CRT. But the reality is that identity politics is just a modern form of collectivism and tribalism, which is an aspect of all ideologies, who all inevitably dislike, to some degree, people who belong to other ideologies because those others don't share their self-deception. Number 4, he says critical race theory is intrinsically revolutionary, as its central named objective can only be accomplished by replacing the system at its very foundations. But many ideologies are like this in wanting to convert everyone to their beliefs and then reordering society accordingly when they get more strength. That's very much what Christianity did in the West after the fall of Rome and what fascistic and nationalistic countries did throughout the 20th century. Number 5, James says, in critical race theory, whiteness is regarded as bourgeois property and is meant to be abolished in precisely the same way as Marx meant when he said that the meaning of communism is abolition of private property. No, this analogy doesn't hold, since communists wanted to take property from the rich and distribute it to the poor, not destroy it, whereas CRT theorists hate whiteness and want to destroy all white people, just like the Nazis, who didn't want to distribute Jewishness, but to destroy it. Number 6, he says, critical race theory exists to induce critical racial consciousness in others so that they too can see the true nature of racial reality. This is also a hallmark of a Marxian approach. This is a hallmark of all ideologies. Most religions, for example, see gods working everywhere in the world, but can anyone else see those gods? No, they're all hidden because they don't exist, just like the systemic racism of CRT doesn't exist. Number 7, he says, awakening consciousness isn't a matter of theory, though, it's a matter of practice. What practice really is a method of self-deception, like any religious person, Catholic or Muslim or Buddhist, performing the rites of their religion to further their self-deceptive belief systems show. To maintain an ideology, self-deceptive practice is important. CRT understands this too. Number 8, he says, in that it is a Marxian analysis of the relationship between race and systemic power in society, critical race theory is utterly hostile to the core pillars and values of classical liberalism. All ideologies are inimical to some degree to classical liberalism. Every single one that's ever existed, because ideologies by definition are false in some respect. That's why people need to use self-deception to believe in them. But since classical liberalism is consistently true, there always must be some disagreement with any ideology. Typical examples would be Catholicism historically, hating free speech, hating usury, hating the development of science, and abortion rights. Islam, hating many aspects of classical liberalism and modernity, which goes without saying. And finally, nationalistic and authoritarian and totalitarian ideologies also hating many of the freedoms of modernity and classical liberalism. Number 9, he says, critical theories must, by definition, have 3 components: an idealized vision for society, a means of critiquing society for not living up to that vision, and engagement in social activism consistent with these 2 goals. Again, these are characteristics of many ideologies, so not unique. So, for example, Muslims definitely have an idealized Islamic vision of society. Everyone is Muslim. B, they definitely have a means of critiquing modern society by not living up to their Muslim standards, the Quran. And C, they definitely have engagement in activism, whether good or bad, to achieve their Islamic goals. Finally, example number 10 of James confusing an ideology with a Marxian ideology. When James discussed core tenets of critical race theory, he gave 12 core beliefs. We discussed 4 before. 2 additional ones are A, a belief that racism is ordinary and permanent. This is true but often characteristic of many collectivist ideologies in their bigotry. And B, a unique voice of color among blacks. Again, it's true this is what they believe. This is very common among racist ideologies. Think of the Nazis with their belief in their Aryan uniqueness, or modern nationalistic Chinese with their idea of intrinsic Chinese superiority. So again, this is not unique to Marxism. In conclusion to this section, do I agree that CRT is Marxist in any way? I would answer technically no, since it's not literal orthodox classical Marxism, Marxism being primarily an economic doctrine. However, theorists known colloquially as neo-Marxists or cultural Marxists and various oppression theorists who are united in their hatred of free societies illegitimately try to borrow or develop concepts from orthodox Marxism in a failed attempt to create a valid Marxian racist theory criticizing free societies. These could be called neo-Marxist only in a loose colloquial sense. I would prefer a term like oppression theorists. And CRT is the result of these oppression theorists using the concept of race and some illegitimate borrowings from Marx to create their theory of racism, not Marxism. So instead of race Marxism, Marxist racism would be closer, but even that would be incorrect. I would instead call CRT a theory of racism logically based on and derived from the self-deception that whites are irrevocably racist. As I just argued, many of the qualities that James attributes to its Marxism are simply qualities common to many ideologies as ideologies. In addition, James himself admits that critical race theory is mostly not a materialist approach because it incorporated so much of postmodern social constructivism into its thinking. So it's not even materialist anymore like true Marxism is. And so yet another reason it's not Marxism in a literal sense. Finally, let me conclude with some miscellaneous points and criticisms. Number 1. When discussing the Nazi phrase Arbeit macht frei, work makes free, which was placed above the entrances to certain Nazi death camps, James says, because Hitler virtually equated Marxists, whom he hated, with Jews, whom he hated more, and because he certainly understood the Marxist ideology very well, it is extremely likely that this phrasing was placed there intentionally as a mockery of the Marxist religion, which Nazis would have equated with being Jewish. To my knowledge, this is pure imaginative speculation on James's part. The truth, if we read the two articles, German and English, on the phrase at Wikipedia, is that it was sometimes used in 19th century Germany by the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard in 1843, by writer Heinrich Bethe in 1845, and in theological texts in 1873. It was also used in the 1920s in Austria. Regarding its use in concentration camps, it was first used as at a primitive concentration camp in Oranienburg, and then used at Dachau in 1933 by Commandant Theodor Eicke, and then by Commandant Rudolf Höss, who apparently meant it in a serious way, not ironically. It was then used by some others subsequently on other camp gates. A similar phrase existed, instigated by head of the SS Heinrich Himmler, and was translated as, "There is a path to freedom. Its milestones are named obedience, diligence, honesty, order, cleanliness, soberness, truthfulness, willingness to sacrifice, and love of the fatherland." This was used on the gates of Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Neuengamme. There isn't the slightest evidence to my knowledge that Hitler played any role in any of this. The effect, however, of this passage on the naive reader, of course, is to impress James on oneself as a brilliant deductive theoretician. But the more mundane reality here, if my understanding is correct, is that he let his intuitive imagination run riot and didn't, as CRT theorists like to say, do the work to check it. Number 2. Similarly, James believes the CRT theorists take the 6 historical stages of Marxism, tribes, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and communism, and try to create a parallel with racial history. He says, first there is primitive tribal equity, then there is slavery, apartheid states, segregation and Jim Crow, colorblind equality emerges. This leads to revolution that installs as dictatorship of the anti-racists to force racial equity, the name for their 5th stage of racial history. The problem is that they don't explicitly create a parallel universe, which James himself admits. This is his imagination again being given free rein. Number 3. Now, I may be mistaken, but James takes the fact that a single CRT theorist, Ibram Kendi, has suggested a constitutional amendment to create a Department of Anti-Racism as proof that CRT wants to create the racial equivalent of the Marxian dictatorship of the proletariat. In my view, one person's suggestion, if that's all it is not enough to demonstrate this. Instead, the more serious danger is that over decades, younger generations will simply become more accepting of these racist, anti-racist dogmas, and then during elections, they may vote for politicians who may indeed introduce federal or state anti-racist legislation. So a slow decline in the long term is the greater danger. What James is also failing to notice here is that in the United States, to a degree, we already have a dictatorship of racial and gender bureaucracies. Just ask any of the thousands of males who've endured the sexual harassment kangaroo courts in colleges created by Title IX in the Obama administration, which mandate gender and racial equity in colleges. This tyranny, to a degree, is already here. And ask any male how many female-sensitive jokes he can make in businesses throughout America without getting into employment trouble. The Civil Rights Acts, with their Titles 7 and 9 of 1964 and 1991, that have enabled those bureaucracies to come into existence and impose their own racial quotas on American institutions, were passed not by Marxists or by COT theorists, but by normal liberals and some conservatives many decades ago. You don't need a dictatorship of the anti-racist to get a tyrannical racial and gender result. Number 4. Note that if CRT were in the universities because it strives to take over the cultural means of production, if their intention was the main reason, as James argues, then that wouldn't explain why many other different ideologies, green environmentalism, postmodernism, disability and fat studies, transgenderism, and feminism already starting in the 70s have taken over these institutions. And that goes to a point that I made in my review of Godsod's The Parasitic Mind, starting at the 742 timestamp. In that book, God used the analogy of a virus entering an organism, just like James does in this book, to understand the prominence of woke ideology. But a better analogy that I used in that review can be visualized by imagining an alcoholic who has gone on a lengthy 6 months bender, getting little sleep and little food, who has finally run down his immune system so much that he catches pneumonia. And God, our imagined physician, successfully treats the pneumonia, but then when the person recovers, he says that the reason of the illness was because that virus is such a deadly, virulent bacteria, instead of telling the person that it was his reduced immune response that caused his illness. James makes the same mistake here as God in failing to recognize that the immune response of our colleges and universities, because of the vast increase of governmental money and control accepted by them since World War II, is the actual reason why all these bad ideas have entered. So James's fundamental analogy, like God's, is faulty. Number 5. Because James doesn't understand how these ideologies have taken over the universities and from there spread to the wider society, some of the solutions that he suggests to us are also faulty. He says, the holy grail of institutional changes that could be made against Marxian theory, at least in the United States, would be recognizing it as a belief system at the level of First Amendment law and jurisprudence. That is, as a religion so far as the law is concerned. No, utterly wrong. Not only is this ideology not a religion, as I argued previously, but the actual holy grail is to realize that the governmental influence on private education in America, especially since World War II, along with the morals legislation of Title 7 and 9 in the U.S., is the cause. Thus, privatizing all of higher education and repealing Title 7 and 9 is the actual holy grail and would bring many other positive benefits as well, such as a huge reduction in college tuition costs. James, being a liberal for much of his life and believing in public education and anti-discrimination law, doesn't understand this, although he does say at one point, echoing theorists like Christopher Caldwell, Gail Harriet, and Richard Hanania, that disparate impact interpretations of civil rights law are clearly too broad and create an incentive structure around corporate and other institutional DEI initiatives. That's good. But getting the government and Supreme Court constantly involved in determining what is true science and what is ideology in all the institutions in America would be a dangerous and regressive step, and utterly unnecessary. So contrary to what James says, that this change would remove Marxian theory from institutionalization in any public institution in the United States, which would have a powerful ripple... So contrary to what James says, that this change would remove Marxian theory from institutionalization in any public institution in the United States, which would have a powerful ripple effect throughout the rest of the free world, the reality is that only privatizing all of education, and especially higher education in the entire Anglosphere, would achieve that goal. So James is right that deinstitutionalization needs to occur. He's just completely wrong about the way to do it. Number 6, James says communism, by which he means CRT, cannot work if it cannot take over the state first, however. It has been supported by the state. That's why the ideology is as strong as it is today. Take away its governmental money and the laws that support it, and it would have as much strength, institutional influence, and cultural power as the Nazis and skinheads in America do. Basically zero. Finally, number 7. At the very end of the book, which proves too little too late, James starts talking about the specific strengths of the West. He says that the cultural values of Western civilization and the institutions that preserve and transmit those values from one generation to the next are an extremely effective Marxism repellent. That we can own things and do as we will with our property within the reasonable bounds of the law is a cornerstone value for all free people. Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's why public education and the morals legislation of Title 7 and 9, which attack the fundamental property rights of individuals in education and morals, are destructive to Western civilization in the long run. Public institutions, educational institutions degrade the West partly by cutting the connection, again, between the more rational values of civil society and these institutions, which no longer need to respect those values because they can get their money and power from the state instead. So in conclusion, what James has done in this book is utterly misunderstand how CRT has gained the power that it has. He's imagined it's because of the slickness of its ideas and rhetorical techniques and the persistence of its followers in intending to take over institutions, when instead it was simply because those institutions were weakened by governmental money, laws, and policies first. Think again of our drunk who contracted pneumonia because he ran down his immune system first. James is the physician who shakes his finger at the bacteria and warns us how virulent it is. But the history of Christianity and numerous other ideologies shows how futile it is to attempt to understand the intellectual power of a set of ideas without understanding whether state force and violence have been used on their behalf. And now, I think I shall repair to the kitchen and, since the servants at this late hour are all abed, do the work of toasting a biscuit, topping it off with some Calabrian mozzarella and slices of fine Suffolk ham, with perhaps a Spanish olive or two. I bid you all well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.